Florida?
My grandparents moved to Florida in 1899, both my mother's parents and my father's parents, for their health. They were from the north. My mother's family was from Michigan. My father's family was from Minnesota. And they moved here because of to get away from the cold weather. My grandfather, Starkey, had tuberculosis, and he was advised to move to a warmer climate. So they came to Florida in 1899.
What type of work did your parents and grandparents do for a living?
My grandfather on my mother's side was a newspaper man, and he became editor of the St. Petersburg Times. His name was William L. Straub, and he was instrumental in leading the fight to separate Pinellas County from Hillsborough County in those days, in the 20s. And he was very active and very well respected. He helped the city of St. Petersburg to buy the waterfront property, which is now called Straub Park. My grandfather Starkey was a bicycle repairman, and he owned a bottling plant here in St. Petersburg for a good many years. Well, for a few years, but he died in 1905 when my father was 10 years old.
Can you tell us what it was like living on a farm?
Well, it was great. It was the perfect place for a boy in those days to grow up. Where I grew up was in Pinellas County, south of Largo, between Largo and St. Petersburg. It was a hog farm when I was growing up, and we did farming too. We had some cattle and grew corn, and it was just a great place. There were still woods around to roam in and hunt and fish. And until I started coming up here, that was really fun. But it was I worked in the summer on the farm when I could, and had chores to do, and was in the 4-H club, and it was just a good environment.
What type of utilities did you have growing up in your home?
When I was born, we were living in a shack. It was just a wood frame building that my parents had bought when they moved to the country in the early 20s. My dad left a job in the post office in St. Petersburg and bought 10 acres out there and moved a little house that had been built. It was like this barn here. It just had one layer of boards between you and the outside. There was no interior walls or partitions. It had 3 rooms, a main living and bedroom area. My parents' bed was separated from the rest of the space with a curtain that they would draw around it. And it had a porch on the front, and the kitchen was a separate room, and then I was a baby and there was a separate room for me for that. But we lived there till I was about 3 or 4 years old, and when my father we built a bigger house moved into it in 1938. Even though we had 665 acres, some of it was in woods, there were still cattle roaming free in the open range days. But my father saw that those days were going to come to an end because Pinellas County was going to grow. And then he started looking for land and found this piece up here and bought this in 1936, or found it in 1936 and bought it, and in 1937 they drove 300 head of cattle from the Ulmerton Ranch across the woods up to here. It was just an open tract of land, 16,000 acres. It was 6 miles east and west, about 4.5 miles north and south, and there were no improvements on it, no buildings or fences or anything. So they had to fence it first and then put the cattle up here. And that's how this ranch got its start. My father served in World War I, but I remember Pearl Harbor. I was only 6 years old, but I remember we were working, it was a Sunday afternoon, and my dad was working there. We were doing something with the hogs or the cattle or something, and I was just playing around with the other kids. And somebody came and told my dad about Pearl Harbor, and I remember him shaking his head, and he was really upset about it. And But the war to me, being a kid at that time, was just, it wasn't that real. It was more like fun games and see the newsreels, and we never had anybody in my family who was in combat or anything. We knew one fellow who grew up there on the farm, went and served in the war, but mainly, I'm just not very proud of this, but when the war was over, I thought, yeah, I was glad because now the toys would be made out of metal again. Toys during the Second World War were made of plastic because all the metal and iron was going to the war effort, and plastic wasn't very good in those days.